What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Saturday. You know what time it is. Time to get into those wide receiver starts and sits heading into Week 7. With it being Week 7, we are right in the thick of things, meaning we have several teams on bye. Most of our rosters are currently dealing with injuries, at least to some level. So many teams, if not all teams out there, we're not bringing in our strongest roster, so making the correct start and sit decisions on some of these players we wouldn't start in other matchups is going to be vitally important. In this video, we'll be going matchup by matchup, letting you know overall how we do feel about the wide receivers in that matchup, the area in which we do have them ranked, so at least by the end of this, you will have a good understanding of how we feel about each receiver. And of course, we do have our rankings listed on our website, so if you're not sure exactly who to start, you can always reference that. Just go to the rankings, whichever player is listed ahead of the other, that's the one we would recommend you starting. The link for our website is in the description box below. Before we do get into the video though, just a quick shout out and reminder that if you do enjoy these videos, the best way to show your support is of course by hitting that like button. It helps us grow the channel, and for those of you newer viewers out there, if you haven't yet subscribed, consider taking today as an opportunity to do so. With that being said though, let's hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was out of the top 10 running backs in PPR scoring, just 2 of them are not in the top 10 in standard scoring leagues. Which 2 players were they? You did have to get both players right, and the correct players in that question were DeAndre Swift and Cordero Patterson. Congratulations to Virus203, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at Julio Lopez Jr. 14. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which wide receiver currently leads the league in percentage of their team's air yards? Once again, that's which wide receiver currently leads the league in percentage of their team's air yards. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. We do have a ton of matchups to go over, so without further ado, let's hop right into the first one, which is going to be the Cincinnati Bengals on the road against the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens in this one are going to be 6.5 point home favorites with the game total projected at 46 points. Starting with the home team, that would be the Baltimore Ravens. There are 2 wide receivers that we are potentially considering in this one. Marquise Brown, he's been a stud all season, and while he is coming off of a poor performance against the LA Chargers, actually his worst performance of the entire season, we already have a large enough sample on him of success, and in this matchup, which is actually on the positive side, you can start him with confidence. Trust him as a wide receiver 2 though, although we do know he always has wide receiver 1 upside. The only other receiver for Baltimore we're considering starting is going to be rookie Rashad Bateman, who had his debut last week against the Chargers. He put up respectable numbers, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 29 receiving yards. It was a less than ideal matchup. We saw Marquise Brown falter in that one. So Rashad Bateman, even though he didn't put up explosive numbers in that one, we're still trusting him as someone you can put in the flex. Again, there's 4 teams on bye, so it's thin pickings. Combine that with the injuries, and with this being a positive matchup, you could do worse than choosing Rashad Bateman this week, who played on 65% of snaps just a week ago against the Chargers. On the other side of the ball for the Cincinnati Bengals, we have 3 receivers. As we know, Jamar Chase, the premier option, he's going to be a wide receiver 1 in this matchup. T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd, 2 startable options, but ones that do come with a bit more risk. T. Higgins, of course, would be the one that we trust the most between those 2. We have him ranked as a wide receiver 2 in this matchup, Boyd a wide receiver 3. Just keep in mind though that the Baltimore Ravens, they were a team that played very poor against the pass earlier on this season. They have been trending in the right direction, meaning they've been much tougher against the pass, but with them so far having a tale of 2 seasons, it's difficult to know if they're going to be a tough pass defense for the rest of the way, or if this can continue to be a defense that we target for opposing wide receivers. Because of that, that is going to overall increase the level of risk in a player like Tyler Boyd, somebody who has struggled in positive matchups. Maybe you choose to go in a different direction, but there's also a narrative with Tyler Boyd, with him being the short to intermediate route, the one targeted underneath, so quite possibly they could lean a bit heavier on Tyler Boyd in this matchup, but it's tough to say because, as I mentioned, the strength of the Baltimore pass defense has been a bit hit or miss. Regardless, just to repeat that, we have Jamar Chase, a wide receiver 1 option, a premier option nonetheless. T. Higgins, more of a back-end wide receiver 2, and Tyler Boyd, a wide receiver 3 option, but one with a wider range of outcomes this week. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Washington football team against the Green Bay Packers. Green Bay 8-point home favorites, a game that has a modest total of 47.5 points. I will mention that both of these pass defenses are extremely susceptible to opposing wide receivers. Starting with the home team though, the Green Bay Packers, usually it's simple. We're only considering starting Devontae Adams. He will of course be a wide receiver 1 in this matchup. He'll get a top top 3 passing matchup when it comes to fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and with him already being a premier option at the wide receiver position, he is going to have a ton of upside in this one. But because I mentioned that the Washington football team is a very beatable defense, that means both Allen Lazard and Randall Cobb, they could have flex consideration for you this week. I would consider them more desperation flexes. If we had to choose though, Allen Lazard would be the option we choose over Randall Cobb. Preferably we're starting neither, but with the injuries, with the bye weeks, you could throw these names into the hat of potential players you possibly take off the waiver wire and start this week. On the other side of the ball for the Washington football team, of course you have Terry McLaurin, who is going to be a bona fide wide receiver 1 in this matchup. The game script is going to favor the pass when it comes to the Washington side of things, them likely playing catch up for this game. There is hopes that in the next few weeks we do get Ryan Fitzpatrick starting, which is going to be a massive upgrade for all of the receivers on this team, but as it stands, Taylor Heineke is going to remain the starter, at least for this matchup. Regardless, Terry McLaurin, with his ranking of a back-end wide receiver 1, he's going to be an auto start for most of you out there. I did mention one other receiver, which you'll notice on the graphic, Diami Brown. He's the rookie who's been playing a bit hit or miss, but with Curtis Samuel out of the lineup, Antonio Gibson also injured, we saw them lean heavily on J.D. McKissick, something we should continue to see in this week, but there is going to be room for another wide receiver to potentially step up, and our favorite to do so is going to be Diami Brown. He's coming off of a 6-target performance against the Kansas City Chiefs, another game with a positive game script, but just keep in mind, and to warn all of you out there who may be considering starting Diami Brown in this matchup, he still has yet to score double-digit fantasy points in any contest yet this year, so to say he's a risky start would be an understatement nonetheless. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Miami Dolphins versus the Atlanta Falcons. Miami Dolphins are going to be 2.5-point home favorites in this one. The projected total is set at 48 points. As we know, Tua, he is going to be the starter, which is going to give the offensive weapons a bit more upside than they've had in the past several weeks. Tua starting last week, we saw that opened up the offense quite a bit. Jalen Waddle, the top receiver for this Miami offense, we have him ranked as a wide receiver 2. He's of course coming off of his best performance, a 29-point fantasy performance where he had 13 targets, the most he'd seen in the season, at least tied for most. He converted those 13 targets into 10 receptions, 70 receiving yards per reception a bit low, but what was most impressive was his 2 receiving touchdowns. With this matchup being just as beatable, last week against Jacksonville, this week against Atlanta, we could expect a similar amount of upside within his range of outcomes, so he does in fact have wide receiver 1 upside in this matchup, and with the other receivers for Miami all being injured, Devontae Parker, Will Fuller, Jalen Waddle will be heavily relied on as an option this week. He'll have a safe floor, a high ceiling. The only other wide receiver for Miami we're considering starting is Preston Williams, and I get that this is a positive matchup, but Preston Williams himself, he is banged up, only able to log limited practices so far this week. While he is going to play, he'll likely be at less than 100%. Already, he's been a player who's needed volume in order to produce for fantasy, and with the most targets he's received in any game this season being 5, although we do have him listed as a desperation flex, he would likely be near the bottom of my list even if I was in a tough position. On the other side of the ball for the Atlanta Falcons, Calvin Ridley, he's been a bit underwhelming to say the least so far this season, but in this one we do have him ranked as a wide receiver 1. Call us foolish, but there just is a sheer lack of weapons in this passing game. Mainly, they've relied upon Calvin Ridley as well as Cordero Patterson. Patterson, if we did have to rank him against the wide receivers, we're putting him as a wide receiver 2. I don't have him listed on the graphic, but for those of you that own Patterson, and I know he can be started at the wide receiver position, that's the area in which I would trust him. Consider both Ridley and Patterson high floor options, but a riskier start that you could potentially get off the waiver wire is going to be Russell Gage. He played in weeks 1 and weeks 2. His snap share a bit minimal, seeing 68% as a high in both of those games. Since then though, he's been injured. We haven't seen him take the field since, and with him coming back from injury, I wouldn't suspect him to play on a higher amount of snaps than that 68% high we saw in the first 2 matchups. Regardless though, we do have him listed as a desperation flex, and for those of you out there that may be looking for a receiver to get off the waiver wire, and maybe you're not starting him this week, but maybe for the potential upside for the future, I still think Russell Gage does have a bit of upside. So while this week may not be the best week to start him, I think better weeks are ahead for Gage, so just keep that in mind moving forward. The next matchup we have is the New England Patriots versus the New York Jets. This game has a very low total coming in at 42.5 points. New England in this one, 7-point home favorites. With New England being heavy favorites, it's not necessarily going to be the best passing narrative for this team. Jacoby Myers being the receiver we trust the most in this offense, being a high floor receiver, expect him to have plenty of volume in this one. We have him listed as a back-end wide receiver 2, and while he's been a wide receiver 3 in most other matchups so far this season, it just shows you exactly how limited we are are in wide receiver options, at least ones that we can trust. The injuries so far stacking up against us as well. So players that you'll notice have been ranked as wide receiver 3s and playing consistently in that range, you're going to begin to notice them increase in our rankings because the value of those types of wide receivers you'll see increase as the player pool overall decreases of startable players we trust. With the New York Jets being a very beatable matchup when it comes to opposing fantasy wide receivers, we aren't only trusting Jacoby Myers on the New England side, I would also trust Nelson Aguilar. In this video last week, we did mention that both Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne were potential options to start, high-risk flex options, and this week we did drop Kendrick Bourne off that list despite actually outproducing Nelson Aguilar. But one thing you should know is that we're not chasing fantasy points. We do look for other stats such as usage, air yards, targets, and snap percentages, and when it comes to both of those two receivers, Nelson Aguilar is going to be the favorite. For that, we do have him listed as a start, somebody you could put in the flex. Just keep in mind it is going to be a risky start. This is a game with a low total, a negative passing game script, but a bit of that risk is going to be negated with it being a positive passing matchup. On the other side of the ball, Corey Davis, Jamison Crowder, the only two wide receivers we're considering starting. It is unfortunate that Corey Davis, in a bit of his floor, a bit of his ceiling, was soaked up with Jamison Crowder coming back from injury this season, and nothing has changed on that front. Corey Davis isn't going to have the same amount of upside, at least we can't project that in any games moving forward with Crowder in the lineup and with both wide receivers expected to take the field this week. Corey Davis, we have him ranked as a wide receiver 3, Jamison Crowder a flex, and while the New England Patriots pass defense is nothing like we saw last season or even the season before, it's still one of the stronger pass defenses that the Jets will face. So Corey Davis and Jamison Crowder being more high floor wide receivers, consider their floor a bit more moderate. Their risk of course is going to increase, but still players you can trust in your lineup and start this week. Moving into the next matchup, we have the New York Giants versus the Carolina Panthers. New York Giants are going to be the home team this week, but despite being at home, they're 2.5 point underdogs. This game does have a low total of 42 points. And starting with the home team, the New York Giants, in this matchup against the Carolina Panthers, one thing to consider is that Carolina, although we do have them listed as a neutral matchup, that is on the back of performances where they played well against opposing wide receivers. Couple that in with performances where they played bad against opposing wide receivers. So with this defense playing a bit hit or miss, that is going to increase the risk for these players, but they definitely are going to have that risk added on to their potential ceiling. So high upside, low floor compared to other matchup. But when it comes to which players are going to be starting for New York, it's a different group of wide receivers each and every week. This week, Sterling Shepard will be leading this team. Other wide receivers of note that are out, we have Kadarius Toney, also Kenny Golladay, but in his place, Darius Slayton, he is returning to the starting lineup, with this being his first game back though, not seeing action since week 3 against Atlanta. Although he expects to play, it is going to be an extremely risky start, so we definitely can't recommend starting him as anything more than a desperation flex, and as for Sterling Shepard, we do trust him as a back-end wide receiver 2 in this matchup. On the other side of the ball though, for the Carolina Panthers, even though the New York Giants are listed as a neutral matchup, they've actually been playing much more consistently against the pass, so they've been a bit limiting to opposing wide receivers, but they haven't completely shut any teams out. So that means when we're projecting out their volume, projecting out their production, it won't be as unpredictable. DJ Moore, who's been a complete stud this season, but tapered off over the last few games, he's going to be listed as a wide receiver 1 in this one. I get that he hasn't been able to put together double-digit fantasy points in either of the last two matchups, but with those matchups being against Philadelphia and Minnesota, two teams that we know in previous seasons have been giving it up to the wide receiver position, well, I would consider both of those two teams, Minnesota, Philadelphia, more along the same lines as teams playing hit or miss against opposing wide receivers, meaning they've allowed big games but have also been very limiting to them. In this matchup, having a pass defense that's a bit more predictable, expecting DJ Moore to have a bounce back game is a pretty safe expectation. His upside may be a bit limited overall, but double-digit fantasy points is a safe expectation, with the upside for 15, 20, even potentially more. For that, we do have him ranked as a wide receiver 1 in this matchup. The only other wide receiver we're considering starting is going to be Robbie Anderson. We have him listed as a back-end wide receiver 3, somebody that didn't quite crack the top 30, but is just outside of that. For reference, we do have him ranked ahead of players like Tyler Boyd, Julio Jones, but behind players like Corey Davis and Tim Patrick. That should give you a good idea of the level of talent in that wide receiver 3 range and where Robbie Anderson stacks up against it. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Kansas City Chiefs on the road against the Tennessee Titans. This one has one of the highest totals of the week, coming in at 57.5 points. Both of these teams have been beaten by the pass in other matchups. Kansas City has been trending up when it comes to their passing defense, so we do have them listed as a neutral matchup. Regardless though, AJ Brown, we do have him listed as a wide receiver 1 in this one. Now his third game back from injury, we've seen his targets increase and snaps increase in each game since returning from injury. His last performance, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 91 yards. That was against the Buffalo Bills. As we know, Buffalo, one of the tougher passing defenses in the league, especially to outside wide receivers, with AJ Brown being able to get behind that defense. Expect him to have a much easier time against this Kansas City defense that is trending up, but even with them trending up, they're in no way comparable to the Buffalo Bills. He should easily be able to eclipse his 16-point fantasy day with a good chance to score as well. So, as mentioned, wide receiver 1, Julio Jones, wide receiver 3, a back end one that you would trust more in the flex. Behind those players I had mentioned, Robbie Anderson, Tyler Boyd, Tim Patrick, and Corey Davis. On the other side of the ball for the Kansas City Chiefs, not much really needs to be mentioned here. We know Tyreek Hill's an auto start each and every week. We do have him ranked as the second overall wide receiver, so a high-end wide receiver 1 option. As for Mecole Hardman though, with this being a positive matchup and his involvement in usage in this offense also trending in the right direction, we do have him upgraded to a wide receiver 3, previously a player we trusted more as a flex. That is also on the back of Tyreek Hill not being 100%, but he did see 12 targets just 2 weeks ago against Buffalo, so this week against Tennessee he certainly does have the upside. Just keep in mind his floor really isn't all that high. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Detroit Lions on the road against the LA Rams. This game has a 50.5 point total, but LA Rams in this one are massive 16-point home favorites. There are a few games with massive spreads like this week, so it isn't going to promote a very positive passing game script for the LA Rams, at least not when we project it out. Regardless though, Cooper Kupp, a wide receiver 1 option as usual. Robert Woods, a wide receiver 2. Woods, as per usual, we consider a high floor option. He's only had one game without scoring double-digit fantasy points so far this season, so in this matchup, despite being heavy home favorites, Robert Woods should still have a high floor in this one. The only other wide receiver we're potentially starting is going to be Van Jefferson. He's going to be a high upside, extremely low floor option for those of you out there that may be desperate to fill your flex position, maybe needing to get somebody off the waiver wire and start this week. Van Jefferson could be a player that you take off the waivers this week, who I would consider starting and prioritize starting in a matchup in which I'm projected to lose by several points. If my matchup against my opponent this week is much closer, maybe I prioritize getting a higher floor option off the waiver wire this week, but if you need a high upside one that you don't really care about the floor, Van Jefferson makes a solid option. On the other side of the ball for the Detroit Lions, you have 2 wide receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Khalif Raymond. They, of course, being 16-point road underdogs, are going to have a positive passing game script in their favor, but most of that's going to be negated by the fact that the LA Rams, they do play very well against weaker passing offenses. Yes, they're much more beatable than they were in previous seasons, but against those weaker teams, they have been performing very well, and I would consider Detroit one of the weaker ones. We have both of those players listed as flex starters this week, but moving into the next matchup, we have the Philadelphia Eagles on the road against the Las Vegas Raiders. This game comes in with a pretty respectable total, 48.5 points. Raiders in this one 2.5 point home favorites. Starting with the Raiders, we do have 3 receivers we're potentially starting. As we know, the top 2, Henry Ruggs, Hunter Renfrow. Those 2 receivers have been playing pretty consistently well so far this season. I definitely believe both should be rostered and potentially considered starting each week. Henry Ruggs, as per usual, the high ceiling option, lower floor option. Hunter Renfrow, the player that they trust on the shorter and intermediate routes, usually on the back of more volume. He's also a wide receiver 3, but the way in which both of these 2 players get their volume in production, it's of course night and day different. One thing, of course, to keep in mind that I touched upon earlier is that the Philadelphia Eagles are a very beatable pass defense, but they have shut out opponents in other matchups. So, and with their passing defense playing a bit hit or miss, that is going to lower the floor but increase the ceiling for all players in this matchup against them. Regardless, Hunter Renfrow, Henry Ruggs, they're solid wide receiver 3 options that I would like to fit in my lineup if possible. And with the ceilings of these Raiders receivers increasing in this one, Bryan Edwards, a player that we have preferred to keep on the bench in the 3 prior matchups, he could be a player you get off the waivers and potentially start this week. Just keep in mind, we do have him ranked as the wide receiver 49 this week, behind even Van Jefferson, Jamison Crowder. But for those of you in a tight spot, maybe you look to Bryan Edwards this week. On the other side of the ball for the Philadelphia Eagles, we have 3 wide receivers potentially starting. Devonta Smith, of course, the favorite out of all of them, but behind them, the wide receivers we don't talk about as often, Quez Watkins, Jalen Reagor. Those 2 are also in flex consideration in this one. Starting with Devonta Smith, though, he is listed as a wide receiver 2 for us. Despite busting in a positive matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Devonta Smith has begun to be a player that we can trust in our lineup. And looking at the 2 matchups prior to that against Kansas City and Carolina, he saw 10 targets against Kansas City, 9 against Carolina, putting up 77 and 122 receiving yards alike. And I would expect his production and performance in this game to much more mirror those 2 matchups as opposed to what we saw from him last week against Tampa Bay. We do have to keep in mind that this is a rookie receiver, and when it comes to rookie receivers, we all know those bust games are going to come from time to time. With that said, don't let last week's matchup be a reason you start a worse receiver over him. But as for Quez Watkins, Jalen Reagor, these are going to be very low floor wide receivers you could potentially put in the flex. Those of you out there that do have strong wide receiving rosters, I'm sure you do have a better option, but throw these names into the hat of potential options that we take off the waiver wire if we're in a desperate position. The next matchup we have is the Arizona Arizona Cardinals as whopping 18.5-point home favorites against the Houston Texans. This game has a 47.5-point projected total. And earlier in this video, I did mention we have a few matchups like this, but in this one, Arizona, they are an offense that will continue to put up points against their opponents despite being heavy favorites. So as for having a negative passing game script, I don't think that would impact my decision on whether I would start any of these players. DeAndre Hopkins, the premier wide receiver 1 option. We've seen him now coming off of his 2 best performances of the season. Expect his hot streak to continue in this one. But looking at the next 3 wide receivers for this offense, that's where a bit more of the question marks are thrown in. AJ Green, Christian Kirk, they have looked to separate themselves a bit from Rondale Moore. For that, we do have Rondale Moore as more of a flex, AJ Green, Christian Kirk as wide receiver 3 options. The Houston Texans are a very beatable passing defense, so the upside for each of these receivers is going to be extremely high. I think the highest floor receiver out of all 3 though is certainly going to be AJ Green, but I would be very surprised if AJ Green still scored the most fantasy points out of all 3 of those receivers. So if you're looking for a ceiling, look in the direction of Christian Kirk and Rondale Moore. On the other side of the ball, for the Houston Texans, we do still have Davis Mills starting for this team. Tyrod Taylor is currently week to week. With that being said, we know that they're 18.5-point underdogs in this one, so a very positive passing game script for Brandon Cooks, a receiver who has played a bit hit or miss, but he's played very good against poor passing defenses, very bad against the really strong passing defenses. I would consider this more in the middle. For that, I think he makes a solid start as a wide receiver 2, one that does come with a bit of upside and a relatively safe floor as well. And into the next matchup, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 13-point home favorites against the Chicago Bears. This is going to be that final matchup that I mentioned has this giant spread. In this one, it has a projected total of 47 points, and on the Tampa Bay side, one thing of note is that Antonio Brown is not expected to start with an ankle injury. As we know, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, 2 receivers who do get the ball spread around pretty evenly. They should be top options this week against a very beatable Chicago Bears passing defense. Chicago Bears, as you may know at this point in the season, they have been a very beatable pass defense for opposing wide receivers, and with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin now being without Antonio Brown, that's going to make them premier options at the position. So we do have them listed as wide receiver 1s. Previously, we looked at them more as wide receiver 2s. So if you own them with confidence. And on the other side of the ball for the Chicago Bears, we have the underwhelming duo, Allen Robinson, Darnell Mooney, both of which listed as wide receiver 3s in this matchup. Tampa Bay has been a very beatable passing defense as well, but played very well last week, holding Devonta Smith in check, a receiver who's played much better than both of these receivers. But with him being a rookie and a larger sample, supporting that this is a positive passing matchup, we do have to side with the numbers on this one. So Darnell Mooney, Allen Robinson, they're both wide receiver 3s in this one. We of course are giving the slight edge to Darnell Mooney, these 2 receivers being ranked back to back, but consider them more of safe floor options as opposed to high ceiling ones. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Indianapolis Colts on the road against the San Francisco 49ers. This game has a low total, 42.5 points. San Francisco, 4-point home favorite. Starting with San Francisco, the 2 wide receivers we're considering starting, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk. Deebo Samuel being a high-end wide receiver 1 option throughout the season so far. Nothing should point to otherwise in this matchup. And with George Kittle still remaining on IR, Deebo Samuel should continue to have a high ceiling along with a high floor, so you definitely should start him if you own him, but those that own Deebo Samuel don't need me to tell them that. As for you out there that do own Brandon Ayuk, due to us having just limited options overall and dealing with injuries, he is going to be a player that we can recommend starting in the flex, but you already know how it goes with Ayuk. Being on this team without George Kittle does help him in potentially increasing his floor, but he's still a player that you should be a bit apprehensive to trust, so if you do put him in there, you already know that he could completely dud for your team. We have yet to see him post an explosive performance, but we have seen him consistently targeted in the red zone, so there is a chance when they get to that area of the field, Brandon Ayuk is a top target. So with that being the case, if you're in a desperate position and needing to fill your flex spot, Brandon Ayuk, a player I've seen drop to waivers in many leagues, could be a player you look out for. On the other side of the ball for the Indianapolis Colts, we have Michael Pittman and Zach Pascal. If you notice, Michael Pittman, we do have him listed as a wide receiver 2, and this is going to tie in with the Jacoby Myers situation that I had mentioned, and that's because there is a lot of ambiguity with all of these injuries as well as the performances of several players. So these players that are performing much more consistently, the Jacoby Myers, the Michael Pittmans, those players are going to continue to be more valuable each and every week in our lineups. This week being no different than that. We have him listed as a wide receiver 2 option, albeit a back end one, but San Francisco is not a defense that we should look to sit wide receivers against, nor is it a defense that we're targeting. But Zach Pascal being a player who's consistently played on 85+% of snaps, he's somebody that you definitely could potentially start in the flex. Just keep in mind he is coming off of a 1-target performance against a much easier passing defense. Moving into the final matchup, this is the Monday night matchup, and it is the New Orleans Saints on the road against the Seattle Seahawks. The graphic is incorrect. It does say that Seattle is 4-point favorites in this one, but in fact they are 4-point underdogs. underdogs. Starting with Seattle, we of course know Geno Smith is the starter, which is going to limit the overall upside of this offense, but DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, if you own them, I still would prefer to start them. I know DK Metcalf had the better day when compared to Tyler Lockett, but I don't think a one-game sample with Geno Smith starting is going to be large enough for me to just trust that DK Metcalf is an every-week starter at the expense of Tyler Lockett. No, I do want to see how they consistently perform, and with the options being limited overall this week, I would like to throw in both of these wide receivers. DK Metcalf, of course, though, is coming off of a positive performance. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 58 receiving yards. Of course, that's not the same ceiling that we were expecting with Russell Wilson, but we do have to temper our expectations for both wide receivers with Geno Smith at the helm. Regardless, in a PPR league that's double-digit fantasy points, a performance that we should see continue in this matchup. Just know, if you own either of these wide receivers, the floor and the ceiling of them is going to be much lower than we've seen all season. On the other side of the ball, we have the New Orleans Saints, and in this one, we have 2 wide receivers we're potentially considering starting with Marquez Callaway. He's coming off of his best performance of the season, over 24 fantasy points on the back of 8 targets, 4 receptions, 85 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. While that was his best performance of the season, just 2 weeks prior to that against New England, he did have a 4-reception, 41-yard performance with a touchdown as well. So that's 2 of his last 3 games in which he was able to reach pay dirt. And in the one in between that against the New York Giants, despite only having 2 receptions, he did go for 74 yards, so his lowest total in any of those 3 matchups was 9.4 fantasy points in a PPR league. With that being the case, he's been a receiver that has been gaining our trust, and until Michael Thomas does come back, I do believe he is going to be a player that we do consider starting each week. For that, Marquez Callaway is listed as a high-end flex option for us, one that's just outside the top 36 wide receivers, so a borderline wide receiver 3 option. But if you're in a desperate situation looking for another wide receiver to potentially have a good game, Deontay Harris is a player you could potentially look towards. He's coming off of 2 performances in which he's now scored double-digit fantasy points prior to this bye week, even scoring a receiving touchdown in last week's contest. And with him being a very explosive wide receiver, he's not going to need a lot of targets in order to potentially produce for fantasy. Against the New York Giants in week 4, he saw 8 targets though, so high volume is not out of his range of outcomes. Just keep in mind we do have him ranked outside the top 50 wide receivers, so he should be considered a desperation flex at best. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.